Well, I guess we'll get started. Thanks everyone. Um, Thanks to Ruth Ann, obviously, for being our what my daughter calls the Zoom princess,
Oh,
right? Okay, the
I
the
just call myself
coordinator of
the
all this,
facilitator.
right? Just a facilitator. It's better, right? Okay. And I'm very appreciative for people being here. Um, and let me
Don't have any
try to make
shows.
something clear at the beginning. Um, I do anticipate that we'll have much more to talk about than what the hour and 15 hour and 20 minutes
Oops.
today will allow. So most likely this will just be session number one. And we'll continue on hopefully in a timely basis if my assumption is correct. The, Primarily my goals today are to address very, very practical needs. This is not
I can't
intended to
hear
be
me.
a session, a group encounter session, a grieving, how to grieve properly. That's not that's not what I wanted to accomplish today. My concern is, and it had been shared with a number of people, is that I think, and Ruth Ann included it in her the same kind of tone in her invitation for people, is that so many of us are from somewhere else, and our families' connections are somewhere else in the country or maybe in the continent, to be respectful to the Canadians here. Um, and what is it exactly that we can and should be doing to prepare for the ultimate demise, and what will be taken care of here, what needs to be taken care of in a home community, where the kids might be, or the parents might be, or the siblings might be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, to the extent that I can give you uh, very, very practical suggestions on how to prepare. The phrase that, when I was doing some research and making a bunch of notes and looking at outlines, um, the phrase that I wrote down was, today's goal is uh, is for us to be getting good at getting ready, getting good at getting ready. So I'm going to talk through a number of things. Certainly, if you have questions, you can ask me or clarify. There are a number of attachments, a number of lists, phone numbers, addresses, suggestions, things like that. Ruth Ann, how are we going to handle that? We're going to send it out later.
Well, we can share the screen and
We
I
can
can
share
show
the
everybody
Okay, we'll talk them through, share the
whenever
screen
you're
if you,
ready. And then anybody who wants a printed copy or an email copy, just let me know and I can get it to you.
okay, great, 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 great. And again, I know that there will be questions about certain customs and halacha and Jewish approach to things. Some of them will be able to answer quickly, and others will just, I've got a pad of paper here to write down for questions and discussion that we can talk about later. I One further caveat: I'm going to try to answer and give all of my ideas and my hints and suggestions. They're certainly based on my 50 years of experience as a rabbi, but I'm going to try to be as objective and impartial as possible in the standpoint of reform versus conservative versus orthodox. There are just as many interpretations and suggestions and customs and rituals that are determined by local custom in a particular community, a particular state, a particular country, as there are of specific guidelines that come from the halacha, and I'll try to point that out as well as we go. Um, One of the so let me just start this way. That one of the things uh, that Ruth Ann has for you to see is a personal statement by a woman by the name of Laura Dickerman, who about 15 years ago wrote a personal statement that's called Epilogue. I don't want to read the whole thing, but it raises some of the questions and some of the concerns that I wanted to make sure we started to talk about. So she begins this way. Again, you'll be able to see the full thing if you wish, Ruth Ann, to forward it to you. She says, "The time arrived, the call came, it was over, he was gone. It's always a shock. Expected, yes, but a shock nonetheless when it finally happens." And I think we've all been in that situation. The moment passes and reality sets in. There are things to do, arrangements to make, decisions at a time when we are least prepared to make them. There are calls to make, times to coordinate, the rabbi, the temple, the funeral home, the cemetery. Isn't there an easier way? She asks, and then she answers, yes, there is. The easier way is to prepare. And that's why I wanted to call this getting good at getting ready. So if I can give you some hints, some suggestions, some checklists in as structured or as informal a way as possible to get you started, you individually, you as a couple, whomever it might be, you as your with your children, to start thinking about some of the things that must be answered. So again, just as Laura includes in her little statement. She says, "Well, isn't this morbid? Isn't it ghoulish? Isn't it difficult?" Those might be your initial questions and feelings to this session. It is hard. Making arrangements is not pleasant, but only after the fact can you know how hard it would have been if you didn't plan ahead. Ultimately, you do experience a feeling of being comfortable. You've taken care of things. You still have the same decisions to make, but not at a time when you can least cope with them, when you're under the most stress. You're not under pressure to remember your grandfather's Hebrew name. And if you can't remember, you can go home and ask because he's still there. Choosing a casket doesn't have the same emotional involvement when you know it won't be filled with a loved one's body tomorrow. You can choose the clothing you feel would be most appropriate, the type of service you want in the chapel, in the temple, at a graveside. There are options. You can make them, think about them, change them later if you change your mind. What will the obituary say? Oops, you forgot and you left out Aunt Tilly. What prayers do you want the announcement to? What papers do you want the announcement to appear in? What prayers do you want recited, either verbally or sung? And by whom? What organizations does your loved one want to be notified? Everything you want can be decided in advance and then still changed as needs and circumstances do present themselves. And she goes on and on. It's a very good statement, even though it's from about 15, 20 years ago. We're also providing a list of selected resources. There are 4 books that I specifically mention here. They're all available either some are in the Temple Library, some you can buy or through Amazon or BarnesandNoble.com or wherever it might be about Jewish mourning, Jewish way in mourning. And then one of the most recent is it's a nice title by some colleagues in the Los Angeles area. It's an award-winning book called "Getting Good at Getting Older" and dealing with many of the questions that we need to deal with. I'm also sharing a particular very important statement. It's entitled "When a Loved One Dies, What to Do and What Not to Do." The source is anonymous. It's just been kind of handed down amongst the rabbis. I had it in my files. Most importantly, the family doesn't call the funeral home first. someone dies at home, call the police, call 911, call the police. It's very, very important. Otherwise, there are all kinds of legal issues that present themselves. If the person dies while under hospice care or at a hospital, then the nurse or the doctor will make the call to the funeral home. But the family doesn't call the funeral home first. Then the funeral home, step number two, the funeral home will arrange to pick up the body. Step number three, the family member should then contact the rabbi if one's to be involved, and then to arrange to meet with the funeral director to finalize arrangements, to sign all the necessary paperwork, to pay for things if they haven't been paid for in advance, and to arrange for delivery of death certificates, which is very important. Step number four is to notify the family and friends of the date and the time of the funeral or the memorial service. And then step number five, underline, 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 then allow yourselves time to grieve. So that list is in these papers that we're sharing. Then I'm also providing, in addition to my phone number, my contact information, should you want my help. There's phone number for the Green Valley Mortuary and Cemetery on La Cañada, here just literally a stone's throw from the temple building. Um, Beth Shalom Temple Center does have a section in the Jewish section. Technically, the temple or I are supposed to be notified whenever there's to be a Jewish burial in that section. But there are graves that are available to people who are not members of the temple if they are considered Jewish. The two cemeteries with which I have experience up in Tucson that where they have Jewish sections, the East Lawn Palms Mortuary and Cemetery on Grant, out near the Costco. Several of the congregations in Tucson, the temple synagogues, do have sections that they maintain for their members, but you do not have to be a member to be buried in the Jewish section there. Um, Similarly, the Evergreen Mortuary and Cemetery, which is at the corner of Oracle and Miracle Mile, is non-sectarian. But again, some of the Tucson temples and synagogues have sections there, but you do not have to be a member. You can go through the synagogue or the temple if your family does have history there, but they also have burial sites available, grave sites available for people who are non-temple members. Um, I really can't make any comments about comparison prices or the services available. I can tell you that in my 3 years here in the area, I have officiated at funerals at all three of them, and their staff are quite professional and quite compassionate and supportive of the individual needs, especially of a Jewish family. Furthermore, and I know this does raise some questions that we'll talk about in a few minutes. Furthermore, I have had personal experience with three of the organizations and services or businesses, if you will, that provide cremation services in the Tucson area. So I'm sending those names, phone numbers, also. We'll talk specifically about cremation from a Jewish perspective, but the reality is that many of our members and many of our families are considering cremation and choosing cremation these days. So the three that there are others, but the three that I've given you on this sheet of paper, those three are the ones that I've had personal experience with. Okay. Um, where are my other notes? All right. So after that introduction of things that we can share, again, that you can have if you want to start a little file, if you're like me and you want to have a file folder in a filing cabinet somewhere. and everybody knows. Every one of us should have a personal, let's call it a personal affairs organizer. Um, and this is just an arbitrary list of the things that should be in that folder, and that others should know. Maybe you have a little note on the refrigerator, or whatever, or ask and have a neighbor or someone else in addition to your spouse, who knows exactly where that folder is, that has personal information, um, how to contact family members wherever they might be around the country, that has basically simple medical information, meaning the name, your doctor's name and phone number, or whoever should be notified or needs to be questioned about a situation when there's been a death. Financial information, including is there a trust? Where are which banks, credit unions are being used? What are the account numbers? Who has access to those? And these days, that means also what are the passwords to be able to access funds online if necessary? Where's the paperwork for the home? Where's the paperwork for your car? What are all the account numbers, passwords, answers to the security questions? It's not only these days with some of them, it's not only what's the 5 letter or 5 digit password. There are also 3 security questions. What was your mother's maiden name? What was the name of your elementary school? What was the name of your first pet? What was the name of what brand was your first car? I don't know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then also some statements about your personal decisions regarding funeral arrangements and your choices and your decisions. Where are the important papers that we've been talking about, and especially those that might be in a safe deposit box? But where are they? Who has access, and how can someone access them? Whatever, as well as a reminder. Maybe again, you make yourself a little check mark of every couple months to go back and just update any of that information. Phone numbers, addresses, all change. You may have changed the bank where you have your primary assets, things like that. Um, this is the time also that I would throw in that if you haven't considered having some kind of an advance directive, and working that out with members of your family, with your attorney, with your certainly, obviously, with your spouse, an advance directive, and a living will if necessary. Uh, uh, Samples, templates, booklets are all available, if not through your own doctor's office, but at the reception desks or the pastoral care desks of all of the hospitals. And I have some samples available if you want to ask me also. But if you've never considered doing an advance directive that will help those who might have to make decisions on your behalf, who are those people whom you would designate to make life changing or life ending decisions for you? It asks questions, and you have a signed response. Do you want life support to be withdrawn? Do you want to continue under all circumstances? Which also allows us, just for a moment, for me to share the following teaching. Jewish tradition is relatively clear that once we don't try to play God. That's that's a clear statement. We are not God. We don't try to play God. frequently we're brought into a situation where the medical the authorities and the doctors in the ER, or whatever it might be, have already initiated life saving or life sustaining methods and procedures. So if there is an advance directive, if there is a living will, and that is something that you personally do not want to be done, you need to have that in writing as a legal document. It's witnessed and signed. It doesn't have to be notarized, but witnessed and signed. Then Jewish tradition steps in that if indeed those procedures have begun, even against your will, Jewish law is clear that we can't demand that they be withdrawn. Okay. Um, the ultimate, let's say, Jewish tradition being clear is that um, we don't do anything to either prolong nor to hasten the moment of death. That's a Jewish tradition, and there are the descriptions and discussions in the Talmud and much later literature about someone who seems to have stopped breathing. We can't even take a feather and put it under their nose to see if there's still any breath, because the feather might inadvertently, accidentally touch their nose and tickle them and startle them and whatever, and either cause them to to continue breathing or to stop breathing, one way or the other. So we really can't do anything like that, even as family members or as friends. So, but once something has some kind of procedure, medical procedure has been initiated by the authorities, meaning the doctors or whatever, we can't intercede and ask that it be withdrawn. On the other hand, when it gets to questions of nutrition or hydration, there's great debate in the literature. Some of the rabbis and the scholars say yes, you can do that. Others say no. The general statement is yes, you can still maintain artificial hydration and nutrition, but it by no means is as clear as the first statement that I was making. Jewish tradition, even amongst the Orthodox, is almost as universally clear that organ donation, as long as it does not get involved in either the hastening or the sustaining of someone in the process of dying, but organ donation is permitted. Some would even say it's encouraged. Again, that's a highly personal decision. It is. Some people would say that it's a mitzvah if you know that by donating an organ you can save another's life for the sake of pikuach nefesh. But again, there's great discussion about it. But ultimately, the majority opinion is that organ donation is permitted under the ideal circumstances. Okay, I come back to making that list, having that checklist, everything from advance directive to all the information that people need, especially with family members being out of town, whatever, they may not even know our doctor's name or doctor's phone number, of how to be in touch with whomever. Um, think of, it's like I said before with that phrase of getting good at getting ready. Think of all of the preparation that we're talking about today. Think of it as a gift to those whom we're leaving behind. Just like we talk about, well, who's Lynn was just having this conversation with one of her friends this morning. Well, there's a set of earrings, and none of the daughters know, really think that they would like those earrings. I've got a picture on my desk. She's wearing those earrings at our wedding, but she doesn't think any of the daughters or daughters-in-law, want the earrings. What should we do with them? Okay. So she wants to make the decision rather than having the girls, they won't be arguing about it, but they'll just be saying, I don't want them. Do you want them? Do you want them? Do you want them? Whatever it's going to be. So think of all of this information that we can leave for those who are surviving, just like we would make decisions about jewelry, about art, about my case, my books. So it was very clear which of my children are going to take all the Jewish books. They've already decided that too. Okay. We need to make decisions. This is a longer conversation. Excuse me. We need to make decisions burial or cremation, not just where that burial would take place, obviously. And we have this list of the cemeteries that do provide in our area, Green Valley and Tucson, that do provide Jewish burial in quote unquote sacred ground, a sacred section, which ultimately means two things. One, it means that it's set apart from the non-sectarian or other religious areas of the cemetery or of the memorial park. In some places, there's just Jewish. I mean, back in Detroit, there are several cemeteries that are just for Jewish burials. But if it's a municipal or a non-sectarian, which is the case here in southern Arizona, then how is it designated as Jewish sacred ground? One is that it is set apart, does not have to be a fence, but usually a road, or in some places even just a sidewalk. But it's specifically known that, and then the second piece is that all those who are buried in the sacred ground are considered Jewish. Now, yes, that does create and raise many, many, many questions. Okay. The standard in southern Arizona, as I understand it, now this may not be the case in Michigan or Illinois or Washington or Oregon or New York or other places that your family might be coming from. Pennsylvania, I see Gary just came on, so the Pittsburgh area. There may be areas, there may be cemeteries that that strictly and specifically follow traditional Jewish law according to the Orthodox rabbis of who can be buried in the Jewish section. And if there's someone where there's a question of his or her Jewishness, they would be buried like across the road or on the other side of the sidewalk, or if there is a friend, they'd be close to the family members, the spouse or the family members who are halachically Jewish. But if there's someone where there's a question, or if they were, and again, I don't want to get into the whole politics of this, but if there's someone who was converted according by a reform or a conservative or a reconstructionist rabbi, and the Orthodox do not accept him or her as being Jewish, they would not be allowed to be buried in that section or in that cemetery. In southern Arizona, and in many, certainly not all, in many places around,
It's being recorded. So
all that is necessary is the communal understanding of so and so is Jewish according to our communal definition or participation in the Jewish community. Very rarely, especially at the time, and we were talking about, you don't want to be trying to make decisions at a time when it's so difficult to cope, or you're under such stress and such mourning and grief. So they're not going to necessarily start to ask, well, you have to show your conversion papers and you have to find the rabbi who performed the conversion or whatever it was 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. In most cases, just the word of the family or the word of a leader from the temple or a rabbi or a cantor saying, yes, this person was Jewish. This person participated in the Jewish community, was a member of the congregation. That usually, I would probably say 90%, that would suffice except in the Orthodox sections where the gatekeepers, so to speak, of the Orthodox Jewish section and sacred ground feel that strong, and in their case, a sacred obligation that only those who are Jewish would be buried there. They feel that obligation not only to their community at present, but to the historical community generation to generation that they're protecting of who would be buried there. There are some Jewish cemeteries. There, I can think of one specifically in Detroit. I can think of two specifically in Cleveland that I'm aware of that do allow, even in the quote unquote in the Jewish section, that do allow a non-Jewish spouse of a Jewish person to be buried there. But they make a very public statement that according to traditional Jewish law, that section would not qualify as sacred ground. So they've got that disclaimer, if you will. Okay. So back to not only with choosing of the cemetery or of the specific section, and again, in recognizing whether or not the deceased or any of us would qualify as being Jewish to be buried in the sacred ground. Okay. Jewish tradition states clearly that burial of a Jewish individual, of the body of a Jewish individual, should be buried in the earth. From dust we came, unto dust we return. That is the clear preference, but it's not obligatory, it's not mandated, it's preferential. And no one who is either has chosen to be cremated or who is not buried in the earth but is buried in a crypt or a mausoleum or above ground, whatever it might be, and we'll talk about some of the reasonings behind that. No one's the surviving family needs to feel guilty or feel that they have gone against Jewish law. Jewish practice, and again, the preference is to be buried in the earth, but on one hand, there's an overriding principle of Jewish law, which is dina de malchuta dina in Aramaic, that the law of the land preempts. We used to say trumps, but we don't say trumps anymore. Preempts the Jewish civil authorities for whatever reason can preempt the Jewish tradition. So Jewish tradition preference is to be buried into the ground. Any of you who have experience in some places in Florida or New Orleans or Southern Alabama or Mississippi or whatever know that many of the cemeteries people are buried above ground because of the water table. Because otherwise, when the floods come, you'd see all the coffins floating away down the river. So the civil authorities of those areas mandate that all burials are above ground. And that's perfectly acceptable in Jewish law. If you've been to Israel, you've been most likely you've visited some of the areas where even some of the most famous rabbis were buried in caves, in the wall, or in sarcophagi, in stone caskets. or just placed in crypts, again, in the walls of the caves rather than underground. So is it preferable? Yes, to be buried in the earth, but is it mandatory, obligatory? No, no, and there we have the history that goes on there. Um, Now, cremation, which has become much more acceptable. I don't, the word isn't necessarily preferable, but acceptable in the Jewish community, was always frowned upon. Again, not prohibited, but frowned upon. And I think most of you are aware of the thinking behind that. Since a human being is created in the image of God, therefore, cremation was seen as a desecration of God's own image, and we wouldn't intentionally do that. There are lots of restrictions against doing things chilul Hashem and that would desecrate God's name, and also, especially as expressed by Maimonides, by the Rambam, the belief that it's one of the 13 principles of faith that God will resurrect the dead at the time of the Messiah. And why should we make it all the more difficult for the Messiah to try to bring together all of the cremains from those who have been cremated? Therefore, make it easy for the Messiah and be closer to the front of the line to be resurrected, rather than I'm not making light of it. I'm just saying that was the overriding theme behind it. Nowadays, just a second, Michael. Nowadays, especially after the Holocaust, especially after the Shoah, when so many of our people were murdered and their bodies were cremated through no fault of their own. Most of Jewish tradition considers it kiddush Hashem, martyrdom for the sanctity of God's name, and it would be horribly, horribly inappropriate to say that those people are not worthy. Those who died in the Holocaust are not worthy of entering Olam Haba, of entering paradise, of being at God's right hand for eternity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, if for no other reason in our generation, now going back 70 years, the notion of cremation has been much more acceptable. Again, is it preferable? No, except in the writings of some on the very, very far, let's say, far left, who say, well, cremation is much more of an environmentally sound, environmentally aware practice. And there are some comments, I won't get into it now, but there are some comments and there's some literature about green burials and green funerals, and doing it for the sake of the environment. And there are some who have been writing about that, not only in Reform and Reconstructionists, but in conservative and even from the Orthodox point of view. But we won't go there today. If people are very interested, we can have a conversation later. Yes, Michael.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Just very quickly on cremation, just a couple of points. In the Orthodox, it's about when a person passes, the soul lives in the Orthodox, the soul. So you don't want to burn the soul, because just before Rosh Hashanah, many Orthodox will go to the cemetery and they believe that the soul will rise at that point, and they talk to their loved ones and that type of thing. One other point that I found interesting, the high elected officials of the United States, I've never heard of any high elected official being cremated. They're all buried. And I found that quite remarkable. At least after my research, I could not find any elected official, even lower end, having their bodies burned up.
Yeah,
That's the point.
I don't know. I don't know, but it probably falls into the category when we make up a a plus minus, a pro and con kind of list of burial in the ground or burial in a particular memorial site as opposed to cremation. And one of the, for some people, the negatives or the cons is that if there's been a cremation, it's very difficult to identify a particular place to go to remember, to pay homage to pay honor to, as Michael is saying, to one of the the leaders of the people, the highest the heroes and heroines and whatever it is. That there's no real place. They're not like, let's go to Grant's tomb, or in Cleveland we used to go to Garfield's tomb, or whatever it might be. So let me list again for you um, what in my experience, um, burial pros and cons, burial versus cremation. In a burial situation, the funeral can usually happen quickly. Now, having said having said that, I do have to add one caveat as far as Green Valley is concerned. Green Valley Mortuary, even though they know that Jewish families ideally that the burial is as soon as possible after the death, Green Valley Mortuary right now, and by right now we're talking about the last several years, because especially because of COVID, considers themselves very understaffed and very overworked, busy. So when temple members or Jewish families have asked at Green Valley Cemetery how quickly can a cemetery can a funeral and a burial take place, the answer is usually no less than 4 or 5 days. So it's something to keep in mind if Green Valley Cemetery would be your family's or your personal choice. Okay. Back to this list again. Um, in burial, like I say, funeral can usually happen fairly quickly. The body can be exhumed if necessary, either if ordered to by the civil authorities or for the sake of reburial. Jewish tradition allows exhumation of a body for reconnecting with family members, especially if the second burial is to be in Israel. Okay. Um, it's a lot easier to accompany the deceased one to a final resting place. A burial is much higher cost. Burial is subject to the local rules, like we were talking about, of what materials the coffin can be made of, whether or not there's a vault that protects the coffin, things like if indeed you even need a coffin, things like that. And then there are now some environmental options, and even I don't want to say this in a pedestrian way, but even cost-effective ways. That now there are people, the cemeteries are allowing multi-tiered burials in the same grave. Cremation is less expensive as an entire process. The cremains can be buried in some cemeteries, not all, but some cemeteries, or scattered to the winds, scattered over the ocean, scattered wherever, or kept in an urn or some receptacle in your home, assuming that the local authorities allow that. There's more flexibility and especially in allowing the time for a memorial service that would take place long after the cremation might have occurred. There's usually a waiting period that may be, in some cases, maybe if you have second thoughts, or maybe just because it's busy. Um, One of the cons is, as I was just mentioning in regards to Michael's comment, that usually when there's a cremation, there's no permanent memorial place anywhere. There's no designated place or a statue or a place for family members or the general public to go and pay their respects. And then again, according to Jewish tradition, it's against Jewish practice. Again, not against Jewish law, but against Jewish ritual, Jewish religious practice. Um, some practical comments, if you will, on choosing a cemetery. And again, in my experience with, like I say, almost 50 years, I've only had one or two um, poor experiences, negative experiences with with funeral directors or cemetery management or whatever. But sometimes there are, and this is why I think it's important to reach out to the rabbi or whoever's going to be officiating in a particular community. Um, uh, I've had it happen once or twice that um, the funeral directors or the cemetery management um, don't necessarily they're not thinking from the standpoint of the needs of the mourners, and so been in a situation where the mourners after a burial they wanted to stand around, and I found this is especially here in Tucson is that people like to stand around the grave rather than leaving and going back to a shiva home or something like that. People like to stand around and schmooze and talk with each other and whatever. But the cemetery management may not be thinking like that, and so they've scheduled another burial in the next row,
Mhm.
and all of a sudden a hearse pulls up and more mourners are coming for another funeral, and we're still standing here kind of dealing with our own emotions. So it's something to make sure that those kind of logistics take place. I can't say that one particular cemetery or funeral home is better at it or worse at it than another, but it's one of those kinds of things that people need to be aware of. Okay, so choosing a cemetery again, not because of the quality of their service. Some people may the beauty of the locale. Some people may have history or be aware of a particular reputation that in this particular cemetery they don't do a very good job of maintaining the grounds, things like that. Um, it is traditional to be buried with your ancestors, but that's tradition. Again, that's minhag, that's custom. That's not halacha. Similarly, it is a tradition for those who survive us to visit the grave. Again, it's not halacha. It's not law. It's a suggested minhag, a suggested custom to do that, whether it's on a particular holiday, whether it's on a yard site, or whatever. And the mitzvah, of course, one of the Ten Commandments is honor your father and your mother. And one of the examples of that is by visiting their grave and saying Kaddish at their grave. If that's an important mitzvah, a life sanctifying act, if that's an important mitzvah for you, either for you to be able to participate in, or for you to have the desire that your survivors, children, spouse, whatever, will be doing that, then that should enter into the choice of cemetery. You want to be buried where it will be possible, feasible for your children, your spouse to be able to visit you on whatever the regular basis is. Um, so there, in this day and age, again, given the fact that many of us have connections, if not history, in other communities, we may have loved ones who are buried in other communities, and the intention is for us ultimately to be buried where other families are. Um, any of the local funeral homes doesn't even have to be Jewish, but any of the local funeral homes, mortuaries, can arrange for transportation. Say that when Lynn and I expect to be buried back in Michigan with our parents and with our son, that's the intention. Uh, the question that people need to resolve for themselves is whether, under the circumstances here in Green Valley or in the Tucson area, is whether things like the tahara, the ritual preparation of the body, should take place here, or whether it should take place in back at the funeral home that will handle the arrangements back in the community where the burial will take place. That's an individual decision. Again, all the local, even the Green Valley Cemetery mortuary, can arrange for the Jewish preparation of the body, but people may choose to just have the local funeral home handle the logistics and the travel of the body being shipped back to the other community. Um, um, but any of the whether of the ones that I gave you, whether it's the Green Valley, whether it's East Lawn Palms, whether it's Evergreen, any of them can make arrangements, especially if you do know any of the Jewish funeral homes or the sectarian, non-sectarian funeral homes in the home community where the burial would be taking place. But they'll just coordinate with the airlines and with the transportation. You may want to choose, again, if you're here, and if this is something that hasn't already been decided upon, you may want to choose a casket locally, and then the body would be shipped in the casket back to wherever. That's usually not the way that it's handled, but it can be done that way. Done that way also. But the death certificates obviously would be arranged through the local funeral home, and you let them know how many copies of the death certificate you would need. Usually, there's a package price that would include, if necessary, that would include the transportation back to Michigan, or again, wherever, Pennsylvania, wherever it might be. That package price would also include the grave, the burial site, opening and closing of the grave. Sometimes they include also the marker stone, the headstone, if that's going to be there. Most of them will offer some kind of a perpetual care that can be included, and well. Um, uh, I know that the Green Valley people, for example, do everything is included in one particular place. When you're talking of choosing a cemetery, I'll go back to what I had mentioned a few moments ago. Is it important for you and for your family that you be buried in, or your loved one be buried in, what's called hallowed or sacred ground, in specifically a Jewish section, only with Jews? It's a legitimate question to ask, and it's a legitimate from the standpoint of Jewish tradition. It's certainly a fair question to ask, and to have made your own personal decision about. If there's a non-Jewish spouse, you want to be buried with the non-Jewish spouse, and what would that mean of where in the cemetery it could be. Most family members do have very strong opinions about that, one way or the other. And the rabbi, me, or a rabbi back in home community, whatever, we can certainly help you sort through those feelings. As we mentioned earlier, burial in the ground is preferable, but in a crypt or in a mausoleum or in a cave, should you have access to that, is acceptable, also as determined by the local authorities. Um, as far as a casket or a coffin is concerned, you're probably aware that Jewish tradition, again, it's not law, it's tradition. Jewish tradition is that a simple pine or simple wood box is preferable, with no metal parts, or anything that again would not decompose or would not disintegrate. That's the Jewish tradition. It is not cause. There was a case. There was a response that I came across a couple of years ago. There was a family that had become much more Orthodox, traditional in their and observant in their religious identity than the individual who had died, a grandfather or whatever. And the grandfather had been buried in a very, very elaborate, almost extravagant coffin. And the newly observant, we call them Baalei Tshuva, the newly observant grandchildren, all were asking to exhume the bodies so that Zaidi could be buried in a more traditional coffin. And the answer from the Orthodox authorities in the community was no, that's not a good enough reason, because the metal will decompose eventually. But whatever, if they were exhuming the body, like I said, to have him buried in Israel, that would be different, because then he wouldn't be buried in that kind of coffin in Israel. But to just change the type of coffin in this day and age, no, even the Orthodox wouldn't allow that. The idea about decomposing is based on one of these overriding principles of Jewish practice, is that all are equal. So even again, all are equal. Even the king of Israel on down to the most impoverished one among us are all buried similarly in the same kind of plain coffin. Just a few comments about a funeral service or memorial service, there's been a cremation, as opposed to the funeral service that might be in a funeral home, in a mortuary, in a chapel, in the temple, in the synagogue. And again, according to Jewish practice, anyone is permitted to be buried or have the funeral service, memorial service from the synagogue. Um, so it's not just for the VIPs or the board members or the presidents, or or whatever. But when it comes to the funeral service or the memorial service, from personal experience, uh, a lot of personal experience, my first request and suggestion is, don't confirm time, place, or whatever, the date, the time, the place of the funeral and memorial service until you speak to the rabbi. I can't tell you how many times I get a call from the mortuary saying, Rabbi, so and so has died, and the family would like you to be officiating. The service will be at such and such a time at such and such a place. And I look in my calendar and say, wait a minute, I'm doing a wedding at that time. Or wedding would be more important. Or there's a board meeting, or I'm teaching a class, or I'm out of town, whatever it might be. So please, 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 always remember to, if it's important to you for a particular rabbi or cantor, or I mean, the same thing could hold for an important family member or a colleague, best friend of the deceased. You know, don't finally confirm date, time, place until you've spoken to those who it would be most important for them to participate. The funeral service or the memorial service, and basically the only difference in the way those kind of services are conducted these days is whether or not there's an actual burial. But we recite traditional psalms. There's a eulogy, what we call a hesped, divrei shevach, words of praise that are shared. That might be from the rabbi, might be from a family member, might be from, again, a business associate, a teacher, a student, whomever is appropriate. One of the things to watch out for, and I say this to families frequently, one of the things to watch out for when you're saying, oh, we're going to have the 3 or 4 member, or the grandchildren are all going to speak on behalf of their bubby, and whatever, is just when there are people who only, once or twice in a lifetime give this kind of a talk or a speech or an or a eulogy, people tend to be very redundant and repetitious. So just be aware of that. You don't want to embarrass anybody. You don't want to hurt anyone by saying, no, you can't speak. But the question is, do you have something to say that your cousin Joni won't be saying, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Otherwise, it can be very, very uncomfortable, and ongoing. There are some memorial prayers, the El Mole Rachamim, uh, prayers traditionally recited. Kaddish is recited at least once. Um, there may be music. There's no reason. Traditionally, music, instrumental music, was not usually part of a Jewish funeral, but it certainly can be, if it's appropriate. And again, whoever's in charge should make sure that the wrong type of music is not being played, that there's an appropriateness to that choice. When it comes to flowers, I'm frequently asked, can we send flowers? Can there be flowers displayed at the cemetery? Um, Traditionally, the answer is no. It's not like if someone sends flowers to the funeral home that we have to remove them. Most likely, and we say this with a little bit of a smile, but hopefully you can understand. Flowers at a funeral most likely developed as a pattern to counter the smell of the bodies that were decaying in the funeral home, in the site. And so they brought in as many flowers as possible to kind of hide and cover up the odor, the aroma that was there in the building. That's not why it's kind of against Jewish practice. Um, and I would never say absolutely not. You can't send flowers, but more traditionally, from the standpoint of Jewish practice, is to encourage people to send tzedakah, to make a charitable contribution in memory of the one who died. And again, that's something that you can, if you're preparing your own little folder, you can say, I specifically would like contributions in my memory to go to the temple, or to go to the Cancer Foundation, or Federation, or Israel, or whatever it might be, some meaningful charity. I want to kind of wrap this up by saying that again, Ruth Ann will be sending out some of these checklists and some of these names and phone numbers and suggestions. There's one more, Ruth Ann. I just realized I had skipped one page in preparing it, so I do have one more attachment that I will type up today and send it off to you to be able to make a packet for anybody who asks. There that are going to be like two or three more things on that last sheet. One is if you are interested, I mentioned and encouraged about a medical directive, advanced directive for medical decisions, things like that. Not only from your doctor's office or from hospitals, the library might even have it, but the Reform, the Conservative, and the Orthodox denominations all have sample medical directives that you can. I'll send the website. I don't know whether you can download them for the website or if you have to send a request and they'll forward it to you. But if you'd like to see them or specifically get one, get the outline and the forms from the Reformed, Conservative, or Orthodox, I'll send you those websites. And then also there's another source that I came across in addition to the four books that I mentioned at the very beginning that are on the list. There's there's a website that called Jewish, I think, for Jewish dot or Jewish dash funerals.org, that gives a lot of background again on some of the Jewish rituals and and things to be aware of again across the denominations. It's not necessarily Reform, Conservative, or Orthodox, but it'll help with some guidelines. And then there's also, because I'm frequently asked this, there's a good simple book that two of my colleagues we were all in rabbinic school together. Although they're a few years older, but two of my colleagues wrote a book that's called "What Happens After I Die," and gives selections, about 15 different selections of traditional and contemporary Jewish views of life after death. So if you'd, I'll put those sources in another attachment as well. Got a few minutes. I know that Joyce said she's got a couple of questions, and I don't know, who else might. We've got a couple of minutes. Let me try. If I left something out, or again, if there's something that's a little more extensive, I'll make a note. And for volume two, Michael, I see your hand, but let me go to Joyce first.
Well, it's actually Mike.
Oh, okay.
Joyce's name is on there,
Okay.
but
No,
she
that's
was
true,
sort of,
right.
yeah,
Okay.
but thank you. First of all, I thought it was very informative. I appreciate you pulling this together. It's obviously a
welcome. Thanks.
topic that's of interest and is going to impact all of us. I'm glad you brought up the idea of the burial that is remote from where you're currently living. And you answered the question that the local mortuary and the one in your particular destination city both have the capabilities to take care of moving the body. Is it appropriate or suggested that should give them a heads up locally that, I mean, what should be done in preparation beyond the other things you talked about regarding the burial site and the casket and everything else like that, the actual preparing for the logistics of moving?
Okay, I think the best way to do it would be choose the funeral home in the community where the burial will take place. Okay, cremation, I'm assuming, would take place locally, so we're not talking about a cremation.
Right.
Okay, but if the burial is going to be in Michigan,
Yeah.
okay, then I would reach out to one of the 3 Jewish funeral homes in Michigan for the pre-planning, if not even paying in advance, but to go through all of their checklist. If the grave has been identified, which cemetery, which grave, which coffin, and you can do all that in a phone call or whatever with them, and then have them research and say, okay, I see that your residence is in Green Valley, Arizona, and we participate in a consortium with Green Valley Mortuary. So we'll notify them that we have a prearranged burial. God willing, it won't be for years yet, but we have all the files. Just if you would please make a little note somewhere that when the time comes, you'll be hearing from so and so, and we'll be working together on shipping, transporting the body back to the Ira Kaufman Chapel in Southfield, Michigan, or whatever it might be. I think that's probably the better way to do it.
What's that? That's good to know. Yeah, that's good to know. So yeah, I mean, we did it about 20 years ago, but it's probably something we need to tell them locally, make sure that consortium exists, like you said, that they have.
Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. They might come back to you and say, do you know if there's a local funeral home, rather than, well, we're 25 miles from Tucson. Is there someone closer whom you can call?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
The question I put, it has to do with not this topic, it has to do with Israel, and I can talk to you about that later.
Gotcha. Okay. All right, fine. Michael?
Yeah. Okay. Very quickly, Rabbi, you did a great job. I think that's wonderful information you gave me. I gave all of us, and that's why I pre-did this last year at Evergreen, because it was it's very in depth, somewhat complicated, and to have some qualified person go through, sit down with you at home and go through this whole thing, I think is very, very, very good to, at least it's a consideration. I just went through the whole thing.
Did they come to you, Michael? Did they come to you, or do you have to go up there and sit in their office?
Oh, no, I went to them initially, and then I went home, and a week later they came to my home and sat down and gave me all this planning stuff and all the information. And but what you did was extremely in depth, and I'm one that appreciates everything that you said. It's not, what you did was not easy to explain, so I appreciate that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And one note about the burial. I don't know, and I always speak from the Orthodox, so that's what I know better, and I'm not an expert there at all. But the idea, and if you've been in California, Los Angeles area, have you been to Mount Sinai, the burial site? It's on a hill.
No, to Hillside Memorial, but not Mount Sinai.
But the Mount Sinai is a hill, and I have relatives there. And the reason for the burial on a hill is simply it's just to be the way it goes is being closer to God. That's the idea of being on a higher plane. I think that's what it goes. And I'm talking from the Orthodox.
I don't think that's just Orthodox. I think
I don't know the other, but also you have a conservative right. But also one further note about the music. The music, when you mentioned the appropriate music, I don't know. And the music is to go to the one who is buried, and who makes that decision if it's appropriate? Well, it's appropriate only if you're playing the music that the person who was buried that's his favorite style of music. And that's one of the reasons is what I believe or know, that there is no music done at an Orthodox burial, to the best of my knowledge, is to avoid that. What's appropriate?
There have been some. No, I think for the most part you're right, and that the only music is the cantor chanting some of the prayers. But I have been to a handful of even Orthodox oriented funerals of public officials, including a United States senator, who would and where the cemetery where the funeral was done according to very traditional standards, where they did have instrumentalists from the symphony orchestra who played that as the request of the rest of the family, and then the rabbi had to agree to it, but it did happen. It's not often, but it did happen. Yeah, okay, Bobby, please.
Yes, first of all, Rabbi, thank you again for the talk today. It was very informative. And I can only encourage everyone to pre-plan.
Right.
When my mom was sick, before she got sick, I spoke with our funeral director back home in Buffalo. And he was encouraging me, he goes, please pre-plan your mom's funeral. Let's come in, talk, sit down. This was a family funeral home, so the family had taken care of everyone in the family. And
Right.
it was so much easier going in. It was hard going in and doing it. But it was so much easier when the time came when my mom passed. It was one phone call, and we did go to the office. He asked, could we come into the office just to go over the final details of timing and et cetera, everything was picked
Right.
out.
And it
My
can
mother had
always
even
be
had her
changed.
stone.
Right. It can be changed also. It can be modified.
Yeah,
and
it was-
everything. Sure.
Yeah,
Right.
yes. So he took care of contacting the cantor, and they set up the timing. I said, this is the time I would like, but we can change it to the cantor's, schedule and all. And he goes, this usually works better, so we did that. But doing it ahead of time is so much easier. And as everyone knows, we had a last minute funeral this past winter,
Right.
and it was the last minute trying to put it all together. The funeral home was wonderful with my children and taking care of everything. They had a spot for babies. They took care of everything. They knew what casket would be and everything, and took care.
Right.
And
Right.
it was in a loving way that it was done.
Sorry,
Yeah.
obviously sorry that it was necessary, but glad that it
I
was
know,
handled
but
well.
they did everything
Okay.
right. And the one nice thing that we never knew about, funeral homes don't charge for babies. We were
Um,
shocked.
Right. Right.
They do not
Right.
charge
I've heard that.
anything
Right.
at all.
Right.
And you've probably
Okay.
run across that, unfortunately.
Ruth Ann, then Jeanette, and I know we have to be a little time conscious
Okay, well, I
too.
kind of just to wrap up a little bit here. I just want, if you're doing a funeral someplace else, I mean, I had the experience twice. My parents died in Florida, were buried in Pittsburgh. So I know how the two funeral homes communicated. But one thing you got, when you try to set the time for the funeral, you got to work with the airline, because I thought my mother was not going to make it to her funeral. My sister was able to get on a flight to come to Pittsburgh, no problem. But with the airlines, you're working with cargo. So they plan, okay, there's so many people on the flight, there's so much luggage. They're going to have extra cargo, who knows what they're carrying. So you got to work with the airline too, to make sure that you're.
Well, you don't work with the airline.
Yeah.
You don't work with the funeral directors.
Somebody's got to work with the airline. I'm just saying,
right,
you got to make sure that somebody's working
Right.
with the airline.
But any of us we wouldn't get anywhere by calling
Right.
Delta Airlines and
But-
say, hey, I'm a gold medallion. I want,
Yeah.
that's not going to make,
That's not going to make it, but you got to make sure somebody's working with them.
Right.
And
Right.
it's probably the local funeral home where they died is more, but you got to make sure, because stuff falls through the cracks too, very easily. That's
Right.
number one I wanted to bring up. Number two.
And incidentally, on that subject, some states have different restrictions than others as to whether or not the medical examiner has to sign off on a body being transported across state lines. It's not federal. It's state authorities.
Yeah. And another thing, I just want everybody to know, the Green Valley Cemetery, whatever it is, we found out when Sam Miller passed away that they're very lacking in some of the stuff that we usually have for Jewish funerals. So BSTC has purchased. So so don't be afraid to go there.
You better identify what you're talking about.
Okay, well, we have the Creo ribbons and we have the Shiva candles.
Right.
So, because they were missing those. So like I said, and if we find out something else that we need to get, BSTC, is augmenting that kind of stuff so you can have a proper, Jewish funeral.
Right. Okay, Jeanette,
Yeah, I have.
how are
one-
things up in Wisconsin?
Very nice, warm
Okay.
but nice. Okay.
Good. Okay.
In Green Valley, I live alone, and I'm thinking of permanently living in Green Valley, so I'll be living alone. Now, if I happen to pass in the night, it'll be a couple of weeks before my cleaning service comes, opens the door and finds that I'm deceased. Is there any way we can leave the telephone number of the next of kin, in my case, Milwaukee, who at the temple?
We have that.
In fact, how will the temple know?
We have that.
You have that.
Yes,
So-
when you filled out your membership application, you should have included your next of kin on there for emergency contact.
Oh, I don't remember that.
Okay,
so-
but that's one piece, and those numbers may have changed incidentally.
Sure.
Right, right. But the other question is, if you live alone, I guess it would have to be make sure that there's a neighbor or
No,
some friend with whom you're in touch. What, Ruth Ann,
Sheriff-
you're
the
nodding your head.
sheriff's auxiliary has a service. If you register with them, they will call you pretty much daily.
Okay, Kelly can.
And if you don't answer the phone,
Hmm.
a sheriff will be there. Because the SAV cannot break down your door. But they'll send an SAV person out, first of all, to kind of look to see if, the place looks lived in. They might knock on the door and, if you answer the phone, everything's, answer the doorbell, everything's fine. If nobody answers, the SAV will call the sheriff. The sheriff will break down your door, which is why they say to get, especially if you're living by yourself, to have one of the lock
The
boxes
lockbox.
for the
Yeah.
for the sheriff. Get one of those.
So we installed a lockbox on our front door for the fire department, right?
Yes.
So do- yeah, so do
They
we.
do
Yes.
that.
Yes, we have,
But I didn't know that about, I
Listen,
didn't know that about the sheriff's auxiliary. How
yes.
do people find out about that?
Just
Other
call
than
the-
like in this kind of a
Call,
setting.
SAV has it in all their materials. So, just call SAV, call the sheriff's auxiliary volunteers. here
Okay,
in
but
Green
but again,
Valley.
unless I mean, that's something that maybe we should, caring community or whatever, should
Right.
notify people, especially those of us who are relatively new to the area. I
Yeah.
had no idea that that was something that they provided.
I believe
Right.
it's
But that-
$75 to get one of the lock boxes.
The lockbox I know about, yeah, and we've
Yeah.
done that.
But the sheriff's auxiliary will call.
Ruthann, the main thing is I have telecare and they're fine, they're wonderful. But do they know, they don't know my religion, do they know which temple to notify? How will you ever know, how will Beth Shalom ever know that I have passed?
Yeah, well, I believe that when you do sign up for this, you have to give SAV contact information.
Right, right.
Same,
Or they
same
tell
thing
you,
like
they tell
David
you,
can tell you, when you go out of town, if you're a snowbird, you have to give SAV contact information that's local or wherever. So, yeah, I'd work with SAV when you get back.
Okay,
okay,
And
One
one,
way-
and one last thing I want to add, since you haven't given me, Rabbi, all the papers that you need to go out, once you do, I'm going to get something together, send it to Stacy tomorrow. and have her send it out. What you call it? Jane cannot send out attachments. So if there's an attachment, it has to go through Stacy. Stacy and I have mahjong tonight, and everybody knows how important mahjong is. So I'm not asking her to do it tonight, but we'll e-blast it to everybody. So even those people who, for whatever reason, couldn't attend today will have this information.
Okay,
Yeah.
and you'll have
Rabbi-
this last one, you'll have within the next like 2 hours.
Okay,
A quick thing, and maybe you can talk about this next time, but the burial of a limb, a severed limb. I know how that goes in for the Orthodox, but maybe you can talk about that next time.
Okay, sure.
Correct. Okay.
All right, well, many thanks to everyone for joining.
Thank you.
God willing, most of this information won't be necessary for quite a long time.
Well, don't die. That's the answer.
That's the answer.
Rabbi,
Thank
thank
you.
you again.
Thank
for
you
putting this
again.
together for
Okay.
Luann. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks very
You're
much.
thank you,
welcome.
everybody.
Fine. No, I don't think we're muted. No.